based very much in Manila. And indeed, the sub-colonialism in Mindanao becomes full-scale, full-blown settler colonialism. Now, why is this? There are all kinds of interesting dynamics that one needs to consider. Fundamentally, and most importantly, the deprivation, the extreme poverty that Christian Philippine peasants were experiencing at that time as a result of the war, but also as a result of burgeoning overpopulation in central Luzon, the central Luzon plain, if you like. And indeed in the Visayan Islands, Negros Occidental being kind of the most well-documented case. Extreme poverty, extreme privation, bred a very broad-based, leftist, communist-inspired insurgency, the Hukbalahap insurgency, the Hooks, as it's known for short, right? With this Hook insurgency, the Philippine state is in very deep trouble, and getting itself into very deep trouble, not being able to suppress this insurgency. The United States military also saw it had a very, very big problem, because the Cold War, the projection of stupendous concentrations of American military power into the Asia Pacific resulted in the construction of Clark Field and Subic Bay. If you're of a certain age, I'm sure you know about these two very gargantuan military bases. It is said that indeed Clark Field, which is was a massive airfield in the Philippines, was actually larger than the state of Singapore. It was that level of machined military power injected into these areas. And indeed they had to be because of the Cold War. They had to be there because of the need to contain China. They had to be there later on to prosecute a massive military action in Indochina, and so on and so forth. So the United States military knows that it can only hold on to these military bases if the Huk insurgency is suppressed. If it isn't, it's quite possible, again, one doesn't want to deal in counterfactuals too much, but it is very, very reasonable to assume that had the Huk insurgency caused some kind of slant to the left in Philippine politics, then these bases would be imperiled. Therefore, the United States military advisors organized, not exclusively, but certainly encouraged and facilitated financially, logistically, and to some extent ideologically, settler colonialism in Mindanao. Don't give them your lands, all this prime sugar land, all this prime tobacco land, all this prime rice land in the Visayas and in Luzon. Don't let them take that land. Let these impoverished peasants settle in Muslim areas. Hence, you dissipate social tensions at the center by expanding settler colonialism on the frontier, on the periphery of the Philippine archipelago. All right? And of course, fundamentally, the solving of one problem, the solving of that problem, was the origins of another problem, which was probably even worse in the long term, all right, as we've seen develop on. Because exclusively, or kind of eventually, the Muslim majority areas were becoming Muslim minority areas, or indeed Muslims were being pushed out of these areas entirely for all kinds of reasons. Probably the most important proximate cause being that Muslim communities in the South at that time and even today don't necessarily believe in the intricacies of land title and land possession. This is my land, and so on and so forth, registering it with the relevant authorities, and so on and so forth. This is not something that was very large in the minds of these various Muslim communities. Hence, they were much easier to displace. Because these settlers had American, indirectly of course, but Philippine government and indirectly American financing and backing, it was very easy for them to embed themselves in these communities. And we see a very interesting dichotomy which we do not usually see in the Philippines. We tend to think of the Philippines in terms of political clans, factions, patriot-client relationships of various sorts. But for a couple of decades, both in what was to become the Cebuano-speaking east of Mindanao, and the Ilongo, more Ilongo-speaking parts of the west of Mindanao. Both of these areas saw a bifurcation between settler and indigene. Basically, those settlers who came in were poor farmsteaders, homesteaders coming in, attaching themselves to very powerful Christian politicians who were building up a local electoral bailiwick in the formerly Muslim parts of the South, and using those vote banks, those client groups, to leverage with the central state for central patronage. I have all these settlers in this area, we'll all vote for you, we'll be good to you if you'll be good to us. All right? You don't see a tremendous amount of class tension. You see a tremendous and indeed burgeoning amount of settler-indigene tension, right? Which is not that typical, at least in mainstream narratives of Philippine resistance. Okay? Now, what allows all this to continue again are the datus that had been empowered by the United States. Salipad Pendatun is probably the most well known. There are a number of others. I won't belabor you with too many names. But basically, these regional strong men, guaranteed to keep Muslims under control, allowed Christian settlement to continue in exchange for state patronage. State patronage. And this is a dynamic that works relatively well until the election, the rise to power of Ferdinand Marcos, with some antecedents, some hint of trouble a bit before. But the election of Marcos fundamentally changed the game because he came from the fringe of the Philippine elite or the Philippine oligarchy. He was less dependent upon established power networks and established political relationships. He wanted to build up his own base of cronies and clients. Therefore, all of these local Muslim or provincial Muslim strongmen that were vote banks, that acted as the managers of these various Muslim vote banks, were disempowered. They were disempowered, they were stripped of their central patronage, and this creates an opening for other social forces to fill. Fundamentally, these are forces filled by ethno-nationalist leaders. Basically, Muslim youth, many of whom are educated in Manila universities, but also Al-Azhar University in Cairo, all right? Sent there on scholarships during the Nasserite years, imbibed a sense of Muslim nationalism, which interestingly enough has many debts owed to the American elaboration of a racial Muslim identity. But nevertheless, they essentially said, and they made a very strong case for the following, that your established elites have abandoned you. They are basically bought, sold, and paid for by the Christian elites. By the Christian elites, by Manila capital elites. Why don't you rally with us, follow us forward, and we will lead you to a Bangsamoro state, a Muslim or a Moro nation or a Moro state. So essentially the hue and cry for separatism became unavoidable and indeed irresistible. Ironically, and again, these are the many ironies of history, the settler frontier had stabilized by about 1971, 1972. By the time the rebellion, the separatist rebellion in the Muslim South exploded, the settlers pretty much got everything they wanted. In other words, while this situation that I've just described to you of Christian settlement is very much like the one we see in a place, say, like Israel-Palestine in the first part of the 20th century, let's say, it ceases to be so. It is not the settlers' intention to eliminate the Muslims entirely from the entire surface of Mindanao. It is merely their intention to push them aside, marginalize them, and take the prime wealth of the island for themselves, if you like. They're being marginalized, not necessarily eliminated. But by that point, I think it was already too late. people were too suspicious. And indeed, a number of actions in which the security forces committed acts of violence that were clearly sectarian in nature, namely attacking Muslim militias, Muslim communities who were protesting displacement, and not attacking Christian ones, I think that already tipped things over into the abyss. And the explosion comes in 1972. You have a massive, fairly bloody and destructive conventional war, which rages on until 1976. Now again, this is something that hasn't really been researched, I think, adequately. But American military intervention, I think, again, is quite decisive. Because, I mean, again, on the surface, it doesn't really work, right? 1972, the United States is already leaving Indochina, leaving Vietnam, certainly, right? But, there was a very broad-based consensus in the American political establishment, among foreign policy and military policy makers, that, okay, we lost Indochina, but we're not going to lose anything else. In other words, we have to make sure all the other powers in Southeast Asia, Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines remain on side come what may. So the levels of military assistance, as the United States is leaving Vietnam, the levels of military assistance increased because these powers had to be stable and these powers had to be pro-American no matter what. Geostrategic global concerns superseded any sub-regional or sub-national concerns as far as the United States was concerned.